book of Ruth is a story that teaches a couple things. Number one, we're going to talk about how it teaches influence, the Christian influence, or the believer's influence on others. Okay, we're going to look into that, and we're going to see the influence that Naomi had on her daughter-in-laws, particularly Ruth, and what came of that. Okay, secondly, we're going to talk about loyalty, and we're going to look at the loyalty that existed between Naomi and Ruth, and talk about the relationship or the loyalty that should exist between two Christians. I think even in particular, yes, as a whole, there's brothers and sisters that I don't know in other states and other countries, and I need to have a loyalty to those people, but even more so to my local congregation that I am involved in. There has to be loyalty. So we'll talk about that. And thirdly, I'm going to talk about overcoming obstacles. This book shows how God's people need to trust in Him and overcome obstacles in their life. And so we'll probably end there. I don't think I'm not gonna get much farther than that. I know by how many pages I've written, and so that usually takes me up to that time. And then we'll go from there maybe next week if the Lord wills, okay? But the book of Ruth, as every book does in the Old Testament, it points to Christ and the coming Christ and His plan of salvation, and shows Christ in that book. And every book, as I said, of the Bible does that. Whether Old or New Testament, Jesus is the center of that book. He is the purpose of that book. And so here the book of Ruth is no different. That was one of the canonizations process. Was Christ the center of that book? If not, then it can't be included. And so some books were not included for that reason. Not that reason alone, but that reason as well. It just didn't point to Christ, such as 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th Maccabees. Is basically a true historical story of some things that took place with some Jewish people at the time of the revolt against Rome. It's a historical story, but it is not inspired, and Christ is not at the center of that story. And so that's just one little tidbit for you there. And so as we read this book of Ruth, for those that aren't familiar with the book, we run into two families, okay? Really, there's three families, but two very familiar families that are talked about mostly in that book. Number one, we look at Naomi and her husband, okay? And her husband ends up dying. I'm going to give you just a brief synopsis of the book so that you understand some of what's going on. You really need to read the book. It's not that long. There's a movie out there I watched with my wife on the book of Ruth. If you can find it, if you're interested, let me know. I'll let you know the title and find it for you. But it was really good. But Naomi is a character in the book. She is the mother-in-law. Her husband ends up dying. Now, her and her husband had two sons, and they end up marrying two wives. This is after the husband dies, and so things aren't so good. The husband dies, but then her sons get older and they get married, and so life starts to come back together. But then all of a sudden, her two sons die. And so all that is left is three women. Ruth, Orpah, and Naomi. That's the two daughters' names, Ruth and Orpah. And so these two daughter-in-laws, they end up living with Naomi. They go to live with Naomi, and those three, in these times of darkness, right, and times of Judges, they're living together, and they stay with her. Now, as time progresses, we see that Orpah ends up leaving and going to live with her people. Naomi goes to them and says, look, I'm too old to find a husband and have more children and have sons that you can end up marrying, or so why don't you just go ahead, go back to your people, back to your family. And both of them say, Ruth says, no. That verse that I opened up with, she ends up saying, no, I want to stay with you. Naomi, please let me stay with you. I want to live with you. I want your family to be my family. I want your people to be my people. I want to be buried where you're buried. I want your God to be my God. And so the story really ends up being about Ruth and Naomi and their relationship and the love that they have for each other, and also the love that they have for God. And so it goes on, and as we read this, we see the influence that they end up having on each other, especially Naomi on Ruth, and we see the impact that it ends up having when a person is loyal and loving of each other, and loving and faithful and loyal to God. Because what ends up happening is, through Ruth and Naomi's relationship, some things develop, and we see that they end up in the genealogy of Jesus. And so some amazing things really take place in this story. Let me give you the key word. The key word I'm going to use for this, I think the key word of the book of Ruth is the word redeemer. Okay, write that down. Key word is redeemer or kinsman. You might have heard those two words together, kinsman, redeemer. Of course, kin means family. Kinsman is a person, somebody in your family who can redeem you. And of course, Jesus is our ultimate kinsman redeemer. And as we read about the kinsman redeemer in this story, he is a shadow of what is to come. He is the shadow of Jesus, and he ends up also being in the genealogy of Jesus. And that is a man by the name of Boaz. Okay, and we're going to talk a little bit more about him here in a second. But the word redeemer or kinsman occurs in this book 13 times. It is somebody or someone who can pick up where one left off. So let me explain. If somebody owns property and has a family and has children and has responsibilities, and something happens to that person and they're no longer able to take care of those responsibilities, a redeemer or a kinsman can come in and take care of those responsibilities. They can also, if that person is in debt, they can come in and take care of that debt for that person. They can choose to work off that person's debt through slavery. They can pay it with their own personal money or belongings. And so that's what a redeemer is in the Old Testament. Of course, Christ is our kinsman redeemer, our brother who has redeemed us. He has paid our debt. We owed a debt to God, and he has come in and said, I want to pay that debt. Well, Boaz was that guy. He comes in and he ends up taking the property that belongs to Naomi's family and was going to be passed on to her son, who was married to Ruth. But Ruth ends up, of course, a widow, and ends up marrying this man named Boaz. And so Boaz ends up becoming the redeemer of the story. And so real interesting to read. The key verse is the one I opened up with. You find that in chapter 1 of the book of Ruth, verse 16 and 17. Chapter 1, 16, 17. I'll put that on the screen for you. Naomi says here, and I've got my Bible here open to it, in verse 16, and I'm reading from the King James. Ruth said to Naomi, now a little bit of background, Naomi had come to her and Orpah and kissed them and said, look, why don't you go your way? Go back to your families. You know, as I said, I can't have children. Go back to your families. And Orpah kisses her and moves on. But Ruth hangs on to her, it says. She grabs her. And she said, look, Orpah went back to her sister, or back to her family and her gods. But please, she says, let me stay with you. I'm going to paraphrase this because the King James says, entreat me not to leave thee. Okay, so please let me stay with you. Let me return and follow after you. Wherever you go, I want to go. And wherever you live, I want to live. She says, I want your people to be my people. And I want your God to be my God. And she says, where you die, I want to die. And where you're buried, I want to be buried. And she says, and I pray the Lord will do this for me. And the only thing I want to separate us is death. And so what an amazing key verse there. From the book of Ruth, that really just shows the loyalty and the love and the influence that takes part in this book. Now, as I said, it's this time of Judges. It's not a good time. I'm sure there were pockets of good times. I matter of fact, I know there was pockets of good times. Like we said, the cycle. There were heroes that arose in the time of Judges. You have, 12, 13 heroes that arise in this time, and you think about Samson and Gideon and Barak and what's the woman's name here? Now you're going to get me forgetting her name. Deborah, and Samuel. So there's just a bunch of them that arise at this time. Some heroes, and here's a hero. Ruth is a hero. Okay, this is a woman that's a hero. We often talk about men, and it's all about the men, and men preaching, and men teaching, and women remaining silent. And yes, that's all true, and that's God's word and everything, but that doesn't mean women are insignificant, not in any way. As a matter of fact, women are very significant in the Bible. They were very significant in Jesus' life, weren't they? They were the ones that really practiced loyalty and were really faithful and committed to Jesus. The women. Even in when we see Paul talking to Timothy and how it was the women in Timothy's life that led him to be an evangelist. Just so many examples, and Ruth is just one of those great examples of another woman who is just a hero of ours, a hero of God's people. Okay, this is a story of love. It's a story of loyalty, commitment, and a story of overcoming. And an interesting thing about Ruth, if you go back to Matthew chapter 1 and you look at the genealogy of Jesus, as I said, Ruth ends up being in the lineage of Jesus. She's mentioned there. And what's so unique about that is how it came to be, right? Through death and being a widow and meeting a new man and sticking with Naomi, and how that all came to be. And watch how God blessed her decisions and how he used her in those decisions to bring forth Jesus, the Messiah, into the world. Now, what's really great about that is the fact that she is a Gentile, right? I think there's 5 women mentioned in the lineage, and 2 of them are Gentiles. One is the prostitute Rahab. What a story for Rahab. But then there's Ruth, another Gentile. And who's Gentiles? We're Gentiles, right? We're not Jews. We Gentiles, anybody that's not Jewish in their lineage. And so that's us. And so here's a story of a Gentile and how she came to believe in God and let God have her life. She gave God her life and was loyal to him and had overcome things, and how God uses her for his plan of salvation. And folks, that's so great to know, because God, it's a shadow of what is to come. Read these stories so that you may have hope, it says. And we read this and we say, well, God can do the same for me. He can take me, a Gentile, and I can devote my life to him, and he can use me for his plan of salvation in others. And boy, he will take me, and things will happen, and I won't understand, and it'll be a journey, and it'll be scary at times and joyful at other times, and it'll be a cycle that I will go through with his church through this journey of ups and downs. But in the end, I can have hope and know that God will do the same for me as he did for Ruth. And I don't want to be like Orpah in the sense that I return back to God, my gods and my false gods and my way of life. And I want to be loyal to God's people and be like his people and be an example for his people. And so, man, what a wonderful story. And like I said, Ruth ends up marrying this man, this kinsman, this redeemer by the name of Boaz. Now, Boaz is somehow related, if I can remember correctly, related to Naomi. And so she's introduced there. And that's how things went in the Old Testament. She's introduced Ruth to Boaz, and boy, they just end up getting together and getting married. And the story is a beautiful romantic story. And it turns out that, now let me remember the lineage, Boaz is the father of Jesse. Now some of you say, well, who's Jesse? Well, Jesse is the father of David, right? King David. And so Ruth is David's grandmother. What a story, you know? What a little book in the middle of the Bible with so much, with such a wonderful story and so many practical lessons. So let's just get into it. I got some practical lessons from the book of Ruth that we want to look at. Some practical lessons from the book of Ruth. Number one, we're going to call this the power of godly influence. The power of godly influence. Now, as you read this book, Naomi, okay, she was a faithful follower of God, okay, and she ended up having such a great influence on Ruth, who was not a follower of God. Like I said, Gentile. She come from false gods and didn't believe in our God and didn't come from that background. But she had such an influence on Ruth that Ruth ended up saying those words that we read in chapter 1, verse 16 and 17. She ended up saying, you know what, Naomi, I don't want to leave you. Naomi, there's something about you that I love. I want to be with you. I don't want to let, I want to be your family. I want to be who you are and be your people. And I want you to be my people. And I want to live with you. I want to die with you. I want to be buried where you're buried. And that's significant. It should even still be significant today. People are buried in the same cemetery, families, and the names are there. And it doesn't happen a lot today, does it? But in those days, everyone buried in the same plot there together, maybe on their own property. It was the family. You got something in Delaware I don't know if I've ever seen in Pennsylvania. I drive down these country roads and I see these cemetery plots. And boy, I just want to pull over and go look at them. They're so old, and some of them dating back to the 1800s, and boy, I think even some to the 1700s. So old, and there's a whole family sitting there and on that property that once was probably their property or their farm, and that's what she said. I want to be buried with you. I want to have that plot next to yours, and I want people to one day pull over on the side of the road and read my name of my body laying there next to yours. And that's the influence Naomi had on her daughter-in-law, on her family, on this person. And some of us have family that aren't believers, that might be atheists, that might be homosexuals, that might be transgender, that might be believers but just aren't faithful. And we need to try to have the same influence that Naomi had, right, on Ruth. She said these words, I want your God to be my God. Now, what made her say those words? What else could it have been but Naomi's great influence? I want to follow the God that you follow. I want to have the life that you have. I want to have the faith that you have. I believe in your God because of you. I mean, what a great thing. Such a faithful example to not only stay with her, which is loyalty. We're going to talk about that in a second, but to be loyal to your mother-in-law. I loved my husband. He passed on. This is my mother-in-law. I'm not going to leave her and go back to my family. I want to take care of her. You're my family. But she says much more than that. She says, I want your God to be my God. I want my deceased husband's God to be my God. What application in the book of Ruth for us today? Look what God is trying to teach us through this story. That we need to live our lives in such an example or to have such an influence on the people around us. We have a powerful tool, if you will, at our fingertips, in our hands, and that is influence. Our families, our neighbors, our acquaintances that are in that circle of our life, as we live for God each and every day, we can impress upon them, upon their hearts and upon their minds, what it means to be a follower of God. what it's like to be a follower of God. This reminds me, as a matter of fact, of something Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5, in verse 16, a very familiar passage, the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus says in chapter 5, Matthew 16, he says, "Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven." You see, people will see the way that we live. They see the way that we talk. They see the importance in the place in where we place God in our lives. They see the importance on where we place holy things, where we place study, Bible study, and church services, and the Lord's Supper, and they just see that commitment that we have to Him. They will see our morals and our behavior, and that is going to influence them in one way or the other. I would say it could impact them, but I'll say it should impact them, because it not always will. It always could, but it might not always should. People will not always choose the right thing regardless to that influence. Sadly, they won't accept it. It won't be an influence in a positive light. It'll end up in a negative decision that they will make. Some will see our influence and they'll realize that exactly what it means to be a Christian. They'll say, wow, it really takes a lot of commitment. It takes a lot of faith, and it takes a lot of changing of my behavior, and it takes, so much to be a Christian. It really is. And they'll say, I don't want to do that. I don't want to make such a commitment. I remember a woman in the church was working on her husband and was trying to save him, and I was working on him with sermons, and a lot of us were working on him, and she went to him and she said, "Why are you not making the decision?" And even her own life, she was a good example of what it means to be a Christian. And so this man, I am very clear, I'm very positive that he understood exactly what it meant to be a Christian. And so she asked him, and he said, "Look, I know if I'm a Christian that Mike is going to expect me to be coming to the Bible studies and to be involved and to help out around there. And he might even want me to get involved in some praying and things like that. And I just don't have the time for that in my life right now with my business." And she said, "Oh, no, Mike would never require you to do such a thing. And he's not going to expect that." And that person came to me and said, "Here's what my husband said last night." And I said, "Well, now hold on." I said, "He's right. That's exactly not what I would require. It is what I would want to enforce, as that is what God requires. And as the evangelist, I want to command these things and help lead people through these things. But that's exactly." And the woman said, "Oh, I didn't know." And with a downcast look, she knew that her husband had made the decision that I want to continue to live my way. And if I end up making that decision, I won't be able to live my way. And so he made the decision through her influence and our influence and teaching that to make. So not always will people make such a decision in a positive light, but there's a good chance that someone will. Okay? But most of all, it's not always about winning someone or losing somebody. Guys, sometimes it's just about bringing glory and honor to God. And so whether a person accepts it or not, we'll leave that in God's hands. We just need to do as God says, and that brings honor and glory to Him. Regardless to what someone says, they can't look at our lives and say, "Well, you're a hypocrite," or "You're this," This is someone who is faithful to what they believe, and that brings, and they really truly believe in their God, and that's brings Him honor and glory. I was thinking about in the book of Acts here. I want to turn there real quick. Acts chapter 4, if you want to turn there with me. It might be there. Acts 4. And this, what I'm thinking about, this is where Peter and John, in Acts chapter 3, they just healed the lame man. And in Acts chapter 4, They are approached by the religious elite and the Pharisees and Sadducees, and we want to talk to you about what you did and how you healed that man. How did you do that? And very boldly, they claim that it was done through Jesus. They were able to do it. It wasn't us that did it, it was Jesus. It was in the name of Jesus, the authority of Jesus, that this thing was done. And they begin to proclaim Jesus very boldly in the face of these men who have the ability to put them to death or stone them or imprison them very boldly. And here's what they say. After very boldly preaching Jesus to them, look what it says about the religious elite. It says in verse 13, chapter 4, verse 13, it says, "Now when they saw the boldness of Peter and John and perceived that they were unlearned and ignorant men," in other words, they're just average men. They weren't Bible scholars, you know. These were just men off the streets that God had taken and had used. And somewhat like Ruth, right? And they marveled. When they saw what they have done and realized these just average men, they marveled. They were in awe. And they took knowledge of them. But these men had been with Jesus. And so they're like, you know, their influence, Peter and John's influence, caused these people to marvel. And they looked unto them and was like, these people have been with Jesus. And when I think about that, talking about influence, think of the word, they've been with Jesus. They walked with Jesus. These are men that walked with Jesus. My mom's favorite poem is Footprints. Talks about footprints in the sand, and at one time there was 2 sets of footprints, but when life got hard, there was only 1 set of footprints. And then when life was easy, there was 2 sets, and then again when it got hard, there was 1. And so the person turned to Jesus and said, when life got hard, why do I only see 1 set of footprints? Were you not with me? Is that when you were not with me? And it concludes by saying, Jesus says, it was those times when there was 1 set of footprints that I carried you. And so it's about walking with Jesus. We need to let people see in us that we have been with Jesus, that we walk with Jesus. Let that be said about us. If anything's going to be said, let it be said, that's a person that walks with Jesus. They're a follower of Jesus. And even if they want to ridicule or mock us, let them call us holy rollers. Let them call us whatever they will. But let it be called and known that I live for Jesus. And not for me, not for my benefit, not because I want the praise of men, but because of His glory and His praise. We want others to see that He has influenced us, that I'm the way I am because of Him, that I've done what I've done because of Him, and I do what I do because of Him. Same with Peter and John. It isn't anything that I've done, it's what He's done. I'm who I am because of Him. I've made the changes because of Him. He's made the changes. So we want that influence. And Naomi's influence was such on Ruth that it ended up convincing Ruth to walk with her. Okay, so allow our behavior, our attitude, our commitment to be as such that when people look at us, they go, Jesus is his king, or Jesus is her king. He is a king in that person's life, okay? And so we need to be that way. Thinking here, 1 Peter chapter 2. 1 Peter chapter 2 says, verse 21, for even hereunto were ye called. Here's why you were called. Because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that you should follow in His steps. And so you see that's kind of that footprint says, and we need to follow and walk in Jesus' steps. That's why we want to be an influence on others, so that when they see how we live and how we talk and how we walk, they see our God, they see our Christ, you know, and we can point them, why are you that way? Well, because of Him. He's that way. Okay. Another one in 1 Timothy chapter 4, in verse 12, it says, let no man despise thy youth, but be thou an example of the believers in word, in conversation, in charity, in spirit, in faith, and in purity. So it's talking to the evangelist here. Be an example to the church. It don't matter if you're young and they're older than you. Be an example to them in these things. But doesn't that go for any Christian? I mean, all Christians, we need to be an example to one another in those things. And then one more in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 1. Here Jesus says this. I love this. He says, be ye followers of me. Or no, not Jesus. Paul says this of Jesus. Paul says, be ye followers of me, even as I am a follower of Christ. And so the NIV says, imitate me as I imitate Christ. And so we likewise, as Christians, we want others to follow me as I follow Christ. Imitate me as I imitate Christ. I need to be an influence. I need to be an example. We need, Christian, we need to understand the importance of our influence, particularly on our family, our children, our son-in-laws, daughter-in-laws, grandchildren. Watch how you talk. Watch how you walk. Watch what you say. Watch what you watch. Watch what you listen to. Watch your attitude. Watch your emotions. I remember a Christian came up to me and said, Mike, it was after a sermon, is it hard or easy to be a Christian? Well, I'd say both in a sense. It's easy in the sense that Jesus said, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Or did I say that backwards? Either way. Yes, I've lived in the world and it was difficult living alone without God, not knowing what tomorrow brought and having no hope. And so what a life to be able to smile and just live for today and knowing He's in control. But it's also a difficult life, isn't it? I mean, to live that way. Okay, I'm running out of time here, so we just need to understand the importance of our influence on another. Now listen, I want you to know you don't have to sit back and hope others take notice. Okay, that's not what I'm saying here. You need to make them notice. Okay, you need to do something. Some people try to buy this as a cop-out, or, well, I'm doing as I am as a Christian. If someone would just see the way I live, and that'll be an example, and I'll win them to Christ if they would so choose. Listen, even though that might be true, the goal here is to have them take notice, okay? Why don't you bake some cookies and take them over to your neighbor? I bet you've never done that, and I bet you they would be shocked and wonder why you're doing it, but maybe it would open the door for you to be able to talk. If anything, it brings honor and glory to God. They're doing that because they're kind, and they're kind because they're Christians, okay? Send them a card. Tell them at this time you're thinking about them, You miss going out in the yard and seeing them pull off to go to work and things like that. Do something to let your influence be seen. Leave your comfort zone and go out on a limb and try to do something, and win them. Okay, number two. We're going to talk about the precious nature of loyalty. Okay, I think that's what we'll call it, the precious nature of loyalty. That's the second point. Okay, loyalty is an interesting word. I would say that it's a character trait of love, if not the very definition of love. Being loyal, being faithful. I don't know that you can separate those words: faithfulness, love, loyalty, commitment. And here in this story, we see a beautiful story of loyalty between a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law, and particularly the two of them with God. Okay, now, loyalty was very important in those days, and it should be today, but unfortunately not so much. It's hard to find a loyal person. I always tell my family, don't trust anybody. In other words, nobody's loyal anymore. The only one that you can trust is your immediate family, and even then, some of them might turn on you, but at least they're worth trying and being turned on than not trying at all. But if you don't want to be hurt, I say DTA, don't trust anybody. And it's sad that we have to live that way. I personally want to be loyal as an individual. Want to be loyal to everybody I know. I think that's why I wear my heart on my sleeve and I just tell you what I'm thinking. I don't like to hold things back, and I don't want to keep secrets that might hurt you or might help you. Now, if you come to me and you have a secret and you say, look, I want to talk to you in confidence, then that's one thing. But, boy, I think we just need to be transparent with each other and love one another and just be loyal in that sense. Naomi, she says to Orpah and Ruth, she says, go back to your people. And Ruth begs her, please don't let me. No, I don't want to do that. I want to stay with you. I don't want to go. I want to be buried where you're buried. I want your people to be my people. I want your God to be my God. Oh, friends, how strong would we be if we were like Ruth, right? What if all Christians were like Ruth? What if we had that attitude with each other? You know, I don't want to leave you. I don't want to depart from you. I love you. I'm committed to you. I'm loyal to you. Yeah, they say that man's best friend is a dog. Dogs are loyal. You know, well, I'll tell you what, a dog love you no matter what. Just loyal to you, and they're not going to leave you. They don't want to leave you for nothing. And that should be a character trait we have. I never want to leave you. Brothers and sisters in Christ, if the church would just be loyal to one another, could you imagine what the church would look like? Can you imagine the size of the church? Imagine all the people that have left. I was told about a split that occurred in Dagsboro years ago before I came, and how families split up and left and went to other churches, and I don't know, something like half the church or something. I don't know. One person said half the church. One person said like 12 people. I don't know what it was, but it's recently happened again, right? Like 7, 8 people just gone. And it's like, imagine if that never happened, right? If we all just worked out our problems. Because really, I bet you if you go back then to what took place and why people left at that time, I bet you the problem was so minute and so stupid and so silly that it could have been overcome. And the same thing recently, right? I mean, some things took place and some changes were made and people's feelings were hurt and things happened, but nothing, I can't think of anything that took place that couldn't have been worked out. But people don't want to. There's just no loyalty anymore. If that happened, there'd be no church hopping. People wouldn't church hop. You know, no picking up and just leaving and going somewhere else. I saw one of those members that left us recently contemplating whether or not the Church of Christ is even the true church. Someone had said, show me where Jesus called his church the Church of Christ. And that person commented on there in such a way that it made them go, interesting thought. And that really alarmed me. You know, not only did you leave and you're gone, but now you're contemplating leaving the Church of Christ altogether. And I wouldn't be surprised at all anyway to see if this person ended up in a denomination anyway. They were very open to the idea of being in one anyway. And so, my, what a sad situation. You know, I'm glad somebody commented and told her and said, hey, listen, Paul said it in Romans 16:16. Isn't that good enough? You know, but there'd be no divorce. There'd be no divorce from the church family. You wouldn't divorce us and leave, and that's what you've done, right? And, you know, it seems to be a quality in some people. Divorce is an option. When I got with Liz, now I always had believed myself to be a Christian. I know I wasn't until I obeyed his will and did his will and repented and was baptized. But divorce was never an option. I was not going to do to my family what happened to me. And I said, I'm going to stop that curse of divorce and happen to my grandparents and so on and so forth. I'm not going to allow that to happen. And so divorce has just never been an option for us. There's nothing that we cannot overcome. And it's likewise in a church family. There's nothing we can't sit down and work out or overcome and get through this. That's what God would have us to do, isn't it? That's a quality and a character trait of our God and of our Lord and Savior Jesus. And so likewise, it should be a character and quality of Christians. It should exemplify who we are, a faithful, committed, loyal people. Leaving and walking away is never an option. I think of Jesus and how he had said, I will never leave and I will never forsake you. First, the Father had said that to Jesus. I'll never leave and I'll never forsake you. And Jesus said it to us. I will never leave and I will never forsake you. And that's Ruth's attitude towards Naomi. I'll never leave and forsake you. I think of Father God when he said, I think it's in 1 John, he said, no one can snatch you from my hand. I could see Ruth saying, Naomi, no one's going to take. She said, the only thing that could separate us is death. Yes, loyalty is important. Now, loyalty to God, first and foremost, is important. Absolutely. But loyalty to each other is very important as well. And so God calls us to be so connected, to be so loyal to each other, that he refers to his church as one. He says we are to be one. I always try to install in you, and we're done here in about 2 minutes, not even. I'm going to be done. I always try to install in you that love is defined as what? It can be defined as a commitment. Okay? You can't say you love his church, but stay committed, but not be committed to his church. You understand? You just can't do that. That's why Jesus said concerning our influence again, they will know you by your love. They will know you are my disciples by the love that you have for one another, by the commitment that you have for one another. Essentially, he's saying the world's going to know that you are my church, that Dagsmore Church of Christ is my church by your commitment that you have. The rest of the churches, the world, everyone's going to know that. What's going to happen if you get angry and you leave and you break away from that commitment and that community and that oneness that you were supposed to have, and you go out in the world and you begin to badmouth that church and say bad things? You're going to completely remove the influence that that church has within the community. And maybe that's your intention because you're angry, but you completely remove that influence. You're actually doing the opposite of what God would have you to do. You have actually kicked against the goads. You have become an enemy yourself of God. You are working against God. You have just now turned that place into a place that has no influence whatsoever. And that's a sad thing. Now look, I'm not saying that you shouldn't leave a church if there's someone teaching false doctrine and they are moving in such a way that is false, and you can't get through to them, and you're just outnumbered and outvoted, and there's nothing you can do, and you're in an apostasy, then you do need to move. As a matter of fact, it's commanded you move on, and it's commanded that you mark those people for what they're doing. I'm all for that, but I'm talking about in things that are opinion. I don't like the way you do this. I don't like your voice. I don't like your attitude. Oh, come on. We can overcome any of those things. So the book of Ruth really demonstrates to believers the loyalty and commitment we are to have to one another. Unfortunately, I'm out of time. I was going to go on to my third point, but I'll pick up there next week if it be the Lord's will.